So first of all, thank you for everyone that is watching. Thank you for the services and all who are watching. Two brief notes before we start. Just saying that today's meeting is being recorded and can be viewed soon on the Intergroup's website as usual. And also there is no interpretation so for all those who wish to intervene, we invite them to speak in English. Our first remark, first introductory remark, I would like to start this meeting by informing you that tomorrow our estimated colleague from the Intergroup board, Klaus Buchner, will leave us for retirement. On behalf of the Animal Welfare Intergroup, I would like to express our gratitude to Klaus for his proactive support for the animal welfare cause during his years in the European Parliament, and for all the animal welfare related initiatives he promoted himself, especially when it comes to the trade of wild animals, dogs and cat meat. You have been also among those who have been repeatedly calling for the mandatory system of production labeling for meats, and I hope that in the near future we will succeed to have it introduced. As a token of our esteem and gratitude, I'm happy to virtually hand you our certificate of appreciation by the Animal Welfare Intergroup. I will also welcome everyone to thank you virtually his work, because it has been a very important work during these years. I don't know if Klaus is live, so we can have a few words.
Klaus is not yet there, but maybe we can give him the floor once he connects. Huh?
Sure, we will give him some minutes to talk when he arrives. So other businesses, also important this week. On the 15th of July, the Agri Committee will have an exchange of views with the German Federal Minister for Food, Agriculture and Consumer Protection, Julia Klockner. The same will happen for ENVI Committee on Thursday, the 16th of July. Hopefully, this will be a very important opportunity for the Parliament to find out which are the priorities of the German presidency of the EU Council for Animal Welfare. For the MPs, these meetings are very important and an excellent opportunity to question the minister in order to get some answers and put animal welfare on the spotlight. Before we start with our speakers, some housekeeping rules. Let me share with you now that we have some rules to ensure the smooth running of this session. So after each presentation by our three guest speakers, you'll have the opportunity to raise some urgent questions. However, keep in mind that the main debate slot about all issues raised during this meeting will take place during the last 30 minutes of this meeting. If you want to speak up or have a comment, please use the chat box which Reineke and Andres will monitor. We will come back to you when our guests have finished their contributions. We'll also invite you, the attendees who follow this session via Facebook Live, to post their questions on Twitter. They can do so by tweeting a question and adding the username of the Intergroup @AW Intergroup. We will make a selection of those, and Reineke will come in and pose these questions to the experts, and afterwards they will reply. So let's move now to today's subject of debate about the role of the third sector during crisis and recovery, with the specific case of equine welfare charities dealing with our current sanitary crisis. The European third sector engages an estimated 28.3 million paid and volunteer workers in the 27 EU countries, in the UK and in Norway. It accounts to nearly 13% of the European workforce and can therefore be considered as a major industry. Due to COVID-19, the situation of many NGOs, also in the animal welfare sector, is becoming more and more challenging. Most NGOs can expect to suffer a significant setback for an extended period of time, and some potentially will cease to exist. The upcoming consequence subsequent economic recession will take the final toll, with economies, charities, and individuals being impacted. This will also have a tragic consequence on animal welfare equine. Despite the role of NGOs in the economy and the gravity of the current situation, there is little to no support offered by the EU or individual countries to ensure jobs are saved and animal welfare is maintained. As some of you know, in May 2020, the Intergroup has already addressed these concerns in a letter to President von der Leyen and Commissioner Breton. So let's move on to our first presentation that will be given by Dr. Matthew Whitaker, Chief Executive Officer of Pro Bono Economics. In his intervention, Matt Whitaker will set out Pro Bono Economics' estimate of the true value of the sector in the UK and will reflect on what this means for the way in which charities are viewed in the national policy debate. So I invite Dr. Whitaker to take the floor.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to try and do the tricky thing of talking whilst I also share my screen so that you can see the slides. There we go. That works very nicely. Pleasure to be here. I can confidently say that I am the least qualified person in this virtual room to speak about animal welfare and conservation, but hopefully I can say some vaguely interesting things about charities, the value of charity and economics. And really the main thrust of what I want to say today speaks exactly to the introduction there, which is that we don't do a very good job, and this is true of the UK, but it's true really across countries, of capturing the true value of our charity sector, the civil society sector. They're just not counted in the national accounts, in our economic data, in the way that they need to be in order for us to really understand the value that they're contributing to our economies and to our societies. And that therefore means that they tend to be overlooked as well. So undervalued and overlooked is the name of the talk, and I think that really is the issue at heart here. And I think the pandemic, the crisis, has really shone a light on that in quite a clear way. So in some way, to sort of provide a bit of context for that, just to start off with this chart, which is taken from a survey which we've been running at Pro Bono Economics since really the start of lockdown in the UK across the charity sector, asking a whole range of questions. And we decided to run it as a weekly survey so that we could take the temperature of charities in the UK, but also see how that changed over the course of the lockdown and the crisis, on the basis that the environment was changing very rapidly and we wanted to understand how that was affecting charities. So this first question really is the catch-all one, which is just, how do you expect COVID-19 to affect your charity's ability to deliver on its objectives in the next 6 months? And the dark blue bar is showing the proportion of people saying, proportion of charities rather, saying that it would have a large negative effect on their ability. And the light blue is those saying a small negative effect. And you can see from the start of the UK lockdown towards the end of April through to the middle of June, the dark blue bar actually does drop off a bit. So you could argue that at the start of the crisis, lots of uncertainty around, lots of charities thinking this was going to have a huge effect on their ability to deliver their objectives. And actually over time, they sort of reevaluated exactly where they were. So perhaps not quite as serious as first feared, but nevertheless, add the two blue bars together. And what you see is that week on week on week, the figure doesn't really change. 90% of charities, and this is the average at the top here for the whole period, 90% of charities saying that this is going to have a negative effect on their ability to deliver their objectives in the next 6 months. Perhaps no surprise there. You know, this is a clearly huge crisis, and everyone's being very much affected. But lots of other sobering and difficult statistics in the survey as well, I think. Not least the fact that there's something of a perfect storm going on for the sector. So we heard that 72% of charities say that demand for their services is up right now, and they expect it to be up over the next 6 months. So more help is needed, more charitable interventions are needed. And yet 88% say their income is down on their previous plans. So there's more demand for their service, but less ability to deliver it because of the constraints on incomes, because of the fact that charity shops aren't able to run, fetes and charity days aren't able to go ahead. General donations are down because of economic problems. So really this perfect storm, and we've put together an estimate which suggests that if you take the fact that there is more demand but less capacity to meet it, altogether you're looking at a £10 billion funding gap just over the next 6 months. That's £10 billion in the UK of unmet charitable need. People wanting charitable help, but it's simply not being there because the resources aren't there. So clearly a very significant hole in the sector's ability to deliver what we as a country want it to deliver. So against that backdrop, the government has provided some support, and in total, the package for the charity sector in the UK comes just shy of £1 billion. So clearly some way short of the 10 billion, but nevertheless very large. But I think the sentiment across the sector is very much a shared one, which is overall that government response has been too little, but it's also come too late and it's too narrow. So yes, £1 billion is a lot of money and much more than the sector has ever received before from government, but compared to a 10 billion hole, clearly insufficient. But I think what also angered the sector was just how slow it was for the government to actually say anything. There was lots of packages being put together for various parts of the private sector, and yet for civil society, for NGOs, the announcement was very slow in coming, and there was lots of concern that the sector was just being overlooked entirely. And then even when that announcement was made, it's just been incredibly slow to actually get the money out. So as of today, I think we're looking at less than 1 or 2% of that money has actually found its way into charities so far. So charities being organisations which are always close to the edge, not exactly flush, not having lots of reserves to fall back on, really desperately need the money sooner rather than later, and it simply isn't arriving. And of course, when we talk about the sector, it's a very heterogeneous sector. You know, lots of very different organisations, very different profiles, very different areas that they work in, and really the support that's been provided by the government is quite narrowly set out. And so lots of charities in our survey have been turned around saying it's great that the government's doing what it's doing, but we don't qualify. We fall through the cracks. We are not sufficiently close to the COVID pandemic to be considered an organisation that is worthy of support, and yet actually what we do is critical. It's just that it's not critical in a sense of dealing with the frontline pandemic issues, and so for that reason we're being missed out. So overall through the sector, and my sort of conclusion from all of this is that really what we've seen in terms of the response from government is another example of policy neglect. Yes, there has been a response, but it's been insufficient, and that policy neglect is not new. And I think it is driven by a systematic undervaluation of what the sector does. As I say, we don't count what the sector does well enough, and therefore we don't care about it enough in our policy discussions. So what is the true picture of the value of civil society? Well, it's very difficult. As the headline says here, officially in the UK, we think that charities account for less than 1% of GDP, which straight away feels like a small number. But the difficulty of all that comes from the fact that, as I say, civil society's output just isn't separately identified in our national accounts. This is true of the UK, it's true of other countries too. Our system of international national accounts has no way of separately counting what NGOs, civil society organisations, voluntary groups do. There are workarounds, there are ways of identifying some of it, but capturing all of it in a neat way is just incredibly difficult. So in the UK, when we talk about official figures for charity activity, we're really just focusing on registered charities, of which there are about 170,000. But we know there are many, many more voluntary organisations, groups, NGOs, social enterprises that don't fall into that strict registered charity definition. If we do use that definition, then we're talking about 870,000 employees, which is about 3% of our workforce. And the value added figure then is £17 billion. That is the just under 1% of GDP. So if that were true, then you might say that actually a rescue package of around about £1 billion sounds fairly reasonable. So actually what we might be saying is that we can be critical of the government for not offering more support for the sector. But if the government is simply looking at the figures it has on the size of the sector and the impact the sector has, then maybe actually it's perfectly reasonable. We can't expect government to help everybody, to help every organisation, and using the data it's got, maybe it's doing the best it can. But as I've already alluded to, that approach to valuation is incomplete. So there's no consideration of any of the institutions outside of the registered charity pools, those social enterprises, those voluntary groups, as I say. There's no material value attached to volunteer activity. So there are some volunteers in those numbers, but the value they contribute is zero because it's based on their salary. And if they're volunteers, then obviously their salary is zero. So the way we just count things in economics means that we're not picking up, and there's lots of volunteers that aren't counted at all. And then even when we get to a sense of, okay, this is the size of the sector, there's then a very imperfect consideration of what the value of that activity is. It's very much just cost-based, because there's no price mechanism in this sector, unlike in the private sector where we can take price as a proxy for value. In this sector we can't, and therefore we fall back onto other methods which are imperfect and understate the true value, I think. So let's try and build up a better figure for the value of civil society in the UK. So we start with that official figure of £17 billion. And as I say, this is a value added figure which really just reflects staff costs and net spend in these registered charities. So no consideration of the actual value of the activity, simply how much the sector is spending as a way of trying to get a sense of how big it is. I think the first thing we can do is add in formal volunteering, so volunteering for organisations. And as I say, these numbers are captured in our data. There is a satellite account which captures the value of formal volunteering based purely on what sort of salary the individuals who are volunteering would get in the world in which they were being paid. And the latest figure in the UK puts that at about £24 billion. So if you add those two together, you're already at £40 billion, considerably bigger than the 17. I would argue that still falls short of the true value of that volunteering, but nevertheless, it's still a much bigger figure, even if we just take it at face value. But then I think you also need to add in the informal volunteering, and this is what is not in any way captured in any of our accounts. This is the volunteering where it's simply helping other individuals, neighbours, friends that are outside of the formal organisation structure. And this, as I say, is not captured. The last estimate that the Office for National Statistics put together put it at about £20 billion, so pretty similar to the formal volunteering figure. But this is something which isn't captured on a regular basis. It's only captured when we ask for it. Nevertheless, you add that in, suddenly you're at £60 billion instead of 17. And then I think one of the big ones really, and this is where pro bono economics work comes into its own. So we work with charities, what we do on a day-to-day basis is we work with charities across the UK to help them understand the wider value that their work is having. So we will go into, for instance, a homelessness charity where they are working with people who are on the street, and we will look at the outcomes that they achieve in terms of the numbers of people brought off the street into accommodation and into work and so on and so forth. And we will then be able to say, using the multipliers that the Treasury use, what is that saving the UK economy in terms of, from those homeless people being in accommodation means there's less crime, there's less use of the health service, there's more tax revenue coming in, there's less being spent on welfare and social security payments. And there's no definitive figure across the sector as a whole for what those spillover fiscal benefits look like. But from the work that we do, and we've worked with over 500 charities over the last 10 years, a ratio of 2 to 1 feels pretty reasonable. It's pretty common. So for every £1 spent by the charity, £2 of savings to the government is raised. So if we apply that in this context, that £60 billion figure we've got suddenly doubles to 120 billion in terms of the overall value of the sector. But even that's not enough, because then there's the other spillover economic benefits, not the savings that's going to government, but actually the extra money in terms of wage and employment effects for the individual. Consider the mental health support that children might get in school. That obviously benefits the government through reduced truancy, reduced crime, all the rest of it. But also it benefits that individual. They're much more likely to get work when they're older, much more likely to be in a higher paying job. It benefits the community around them. And on this, we're on even shakier ground in terms of working out exactly what the figure should be. Again, in the work that we do at Pro Bono Economics, we show that it is very significant, but it varies quite considerably from intervention to intervention. And in some instances, it's just very hard to pin down because there's not great data there. So on this, if I'm honest, we've not sort of come up with a ratio as such. We've more or less just rounded to 200 billion pounds as being a conservative but reasonable estimate for the total value of the sector. I think we could plug in numbers which would get us much above the 200 billion, but I think people would start to raise eyebrows. So we go with the 200 billion as being something that we feel confident is almost a minimum for the value of the sector. So what does that mean? That means that rescue package of £1 billion sounded reasonable, but now we sort of know the truth. It doesn't really, because we're not talking about a sector that accounts for less than 1% of GDP. We're talking about a sector that could be as much as 10% of GDP, if not more. So what do we do? Well, better valuation methods do exist. I've got the link there to a UN handbook, which is work run by Lester Salomon at the Johns Hopkins Centre for Civil Society Studies, which is really an attempt, recognition that civil society is invisible in our standard economic accounts, and that we need to do a better job. And so they've put together a methodology which allows us to get closer to the true value, certainly get closer to the true size of the sector. So they've produced a methodology for producing those satellite accounts, which is freely available, and all countries are encouraged to adopt it. And it also does have a sort of theoretical framework for estimating those spillover benefits that I've just talked about. So that is a bit further away from being sort of ready to plug in as a standard thing, but nevertheless, the fact that there is a theoretical framework means that there's something we can start from and start to build on. But adoption pretty variable across countries. So I think overall 27 countries have completed or started work on one of those satellite accounts, which tries to pick out the size of the civil society sector in their countries. And in Europe, we're looking at Belgium, Canada, Czech Republic, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Norway, Portugal, Slovakia, and Sweden. It's also the case that Eurostat and the European Commission's Directorate for Enterprise have provided technical assistance to this whole project, which is obviously encouraging. But lots of countries, UK included, haven't gone down that route, primarily for reasons of resource. As everywhere else, statistical agencies only have finite resources and have not concluded that this is a priority for them, amongst other things. And so not adopting this, even though I think they would recognise that it is a better route. And I think even where it is being used, it's not necessarily being used in an entirely systematic way, or in a consistent way, or necessarily in a repeatable way, maybe a one-off. So I think there's a strong push still needed to make this standard. So a few quick conclusions then from all of that. First of all, certainly this is true of the UK. My guess is it's true of other countries. Civil society organisations facing a perfect storm right now, increased demand for their help just at the time that they're a bit constrained. Government chairs and for volunteers, but the vital role that the sector plays is under threat, because the funding gap that is opening up is huge, and the support that's come in from the government has not been significant enough. And I think that starts with the fact that this undervaluation of the sector is something which has been in place for a long time, and the pandemic has really sort of shone a light on that, and just means that it's even more urgent than it was before for us to fix that, and to come up with a better valuation of the sector, and have the government accept that, understand that, and therefore try to support the sector to the extent that it needs to, because ultimately this is a sector which confers huge benefit, not just to the individuals that are going through the interventions that the charities provide, but to all of us. And I'll end there. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Whittaker. Very concise and precise data that you have shown us, and give us an overview of the UK situation, and we can also correlate it to other EU countries. I will now take one or two questions. We will take one or two quick questions regarding this issue. I'll give the floor to Reineke so she can make this bridge.
Thank you, Francisco, and hello everyone. Good morning. Some of you can't use the chat box this morning, so if you would like to come in, could I ask everyone to raise your hand? There's a function in the right box that says raise hand. I would also be very happy to just invite some MEPs to come in and speak up. I see that we already have an MEP who would like to ask a question. Mrs. Rose, the floor is yours. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Alors, je vais allumer mon micro, je vais poser ma question. Je vais poser ma question en français et j'ai Antoine qui va traduire. En fait, cet exposé que vous avez fait sur l'Angleterre, j'ai des similitudes en France en fait avec des petites associations locales où on a énormément de bénévoles qui travaillent pour sauver ces associations. On s'est retrouvé avec une problématique immense pendant la période de crise du Covid parce que les bénévoles ne pouvaient plus accéder aux associations, les animaux, etc. Les associations avaient moins de dons aussi parce que c'était une période de crise et d'ailleurs ils ont encore moins de dons aujourd'hui. Mais la comptabilisation de ces bénévoles, vous parlez de bénévoles formels et informels. Dans une association, un exemple ici, on a une quinzaine de bénévoles qui ne sont pas répertoriés. Comment est-ce qu'on peut améliorer cette méthode d'évaluation de ces bénévoles informels en fait? Je te laisse traduire, Antoine.
Thank you, Mrs. Rose. I could catch
Est-ce que vous pouvez rajouter Antoine pour qu'il puisse faire la traduction parce qu'il n'est pas dans le groupe?
No worries, no worries. I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that you reflected on the situation in France where you were saying that charities, but also volunteers are heavily affected by COVID-19, that they are not able to do their work and that they are under a lot of pressure. I think this is a huge issue for many of the animal charities in Europe at the moment that are working with animal protection. So could I ask Mr. Whittaker to respond to Mrs. Rose and reflect a bit on, the trends you are seeing in other European countries, but also how do you see the role of the European Union? What could the European Union do in this respect, also noting that this falls under the competence of the member states?
Sure, good question. So it's worth saying with the survey that we've been running on a weekly basis of UK charities, I've focused today on the funding gap and on the financial pressures that the charities are under. Actually, consistently, the message we've got is the biggest single concern, certainly through the first sort of 10 weeks of lockdown, has been around the inability to provide services because of social distancing, because of the restrictions around the ability to have physical interaction with people. Lots of those organizations that are working face to face with people in some very vulnerable circumstances are simply unable to deliver those services. And we're seeing charities try and change their models, not least because, as we know, this may be a state of affairs that persists for some time. And so increasingly charities are looking to work online as far as possible and just to develop new ways of working. But this is a real concern for lots of organizations. And in terms of, as with all organizations, having staff members who have vulnerabilities and have to be shielded and can't work in the normal way. So lots of concerns that go well beyond just the financing issues. Although increasingly, I think what's interesting is in the survey, in those first few weeks, we had organizations saying to us that they felt they were just going to go out of business. There was an immediate problem which needed fixing. Now, the message we're getting through very, very clearly is a need to think about 2021 and what the fundraising environment looks like in 2021, and what the sort of practical arrangements for undertaking their work looks like in 2021. So there's a appetite and a desire to have some clarity about what the future might hold, and think about this is, even as the crisis itself hopefully starts to fade into the background, this is a cloud that's going to hang over charities for a very long time, and they don't want that to be lost. And I think in terms of the European Union, and it's true, I think, of all sort of political leaders, I think there's a very strong case at the moment, and the phrase that gets used in the UK a lot now is build back better. So we've had the crisis. We hopefully will come into some form of recovery, but we don't want to return to the old normal, to just go back to business as usual. Actually, we want to take this as being an opportunity to say, can we build a better country? And in particular, thinking about the third sector, charities, civil society, I think there's a sense that we've seen a huge surge in the UK in volunteering, and I think that is true of other countries as well, and people wanting to help out, and neighbourhood groups coming together, and a sense that, you know, the old Mrs. Thatcher statement of there's no such thing as society, which has sort of hung over the UK for a few decades thereafter. Actually, Boris Johnson has explicitly come out and said it turns out there is such a thing as society, and so there's a movement now to say, can we start to create a new normal in which civil society just plays a stronger role, is recognised as being an equal partner with the private sector and with other parts of the economy, and is factored into all of the planning that we do. I think the European Union, as an organisation, you know, a supranational organisation that, to my mind at least, has a very strong role to play as a visionary. I think the European Union can play a very strong role in helping take that message forward, in making it just part and parcel of what a modern economy, modern countries look like, to say that yes, we have a market system with businesses, private sector, but equally we have a civil society which is strong, confident, and playing a full role in what we do.
Thank you so much for that. I think, as you said, the third sector is hugely underestimated also at EU level. As we speak, the EU is discussing the recovery budget, which are massive. And I think it would be excellent, Francesco, if the Intergroup could send a strong signal to the European Commission to make sure that the charity sector is included also in these recovery budgets, in the guidance to the member states. That could be a potential outcome of today's meeting. But we are running out of time a bit, Francesco, so I'm handing back to you to introduce the second speaker.
Yes, sure. Let's then move on to our second speaker. That is Barbara Massa, Regional Director for Europe at Donkey Sanctuary. Barbara will tell us now more the challenges of equine welfare NGOs, which are facing in the current COVID-19 crisis. As we all know, during this crisis, it has become a reality that equine welfare organizations across Europe have to face a wide range of obstacles in their daily work. This is particularly true for equine rescue organizations operating in the Mediterranean Sea, where working equids are still used in higher numbers. I can speak from experience because I'm from Portugal, and this is a dire problem here in my country. So I'll give the floor to Barbara, and I would also ask to try to limit to the 15 minutes so we have time to then make some questions and dialogue a bit more. So I give the floor to Barbara. Barbara, is it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
we are listening. We are listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Francisco. So let's start. Okay, so sorry. Okay, dear attendees, I'm honored to take you on a journey across Europe to experience the fieldwork that any equine welfare organization daily deals with, and which has been made so much worse by the COVID-19. You will visit several countries, but besides the differences in culture, language, attitudes toward animals and legislation, we observe recurrent and common issues. I have selected case studies that will show you some of the main challenges of this vast and complex scenario. So let's start in Ireland. With an ongoing case, the Donkey Sanctuary Ireland, the Irish branch of the Donkey Sanctuary, has been evolving, along with the Department of Agriculture. This is a classic example of indiscriminate breeding. The picture mainly shows the pregnant mares and youngers in the herd, consisting of 52 equids on site, including ponies and horses, as you can see from the picture. To date, we had to euthanize 3 animals on site to avoid further suffering. As you can see, the hooves are in a various state of neglect. The small dark brown foal was born that morning in the pouring rain and died the following day from pneumonia despite our best efforts. The Donkey Sanctuary and another equine charity worked together to remove and rehome as many as possible. This was once an open farm, but closed during the last recession and is still carry on. Open farms in Ireland are places where families and schools can get in contact with farm animals. When run well, they can be an excellent way to educate and promote good welfare standards. But sadly, plenty are just business and build up a surplus of unwanted animals. As in this case, where no attempt was made to prevent the overpopulation of the herd. It sums up the most common welfare concern about lack of responsible ownership in just one picture. For example, overweight, laminitis, long hooves, no shelter, and indiscriminate breeding. Let us move now to Italy. A herd of more than 40 donkeys was found abandoned by local authorities on mountain pastures and moved to a safe and closer barn. Many were dead, while the majority were found in appalling condition. Il Rifugio degli Asinelli, the Italian branch of the Donkey Sanctuary, supported the veterinary authorities to find safe homes for all donkeys, while the trial against the owners is still open. In the last few years, as the EU provided funds to prevent the abandonment of alpine pastures, several fraud cases among farmers emerged across Italy. In all cases related to equids, herds were moved to mountains at the beginning of the summer and abandoned there without any supervision, de facto putting at risk their welfare and lives. Abandonment occurs everywhere in Europe for many different reasons, and rarely institutional bodies provide funds and appropriate facility for short and long-term care. And so the necessary rescue and care lay on the shoulders of charity. Let us go to Romania now. Working equids still play a major role in the country, where the majority of animals belong to the poorest communities in rural and peri-urban environment. Owners can rarely afford to pay for any veterinary care, and they are unlikely able to pay for human euthanasia where necessary. Donkeys and other equines are valuable assets while they are able to work, and after that, their destiny is uncertain. In many cases, they are still profitable to some dealers, mainly involved in the market for equine meat, and to the Roma communities, with whom is unfortunately extremely challenging to set up any successful equine welfare program. And we are in Spain now. This was a massive operation by El Refugio del Burrito, the Spanish branch of the Donkey Sanctuary, in collaboration with the Animal Welfare Force of the Guardia Civil, the local enforcement agency. They received an anonymous handwritten note, and when the team went to check, was totally shocked about what it found. 21 donkeys, mules, horses, and ponies in a state of complete abandonment, alongside rotted and buried carcasses. One was euthanized in situ, and 3 died during the following days. Animals were just held in facility with no care. Sadly, it is a recurrent scenario in Spain, where dealers keep animals in illegal setting with no vet care, little or no food and water, sometimes not even the minimum necessary, as any investment is seen as a waste of money. They would sell equines anyway and in any condition. It's not so uncommon that some equine appears on social media through appeals to get the attention of sensitive people who would pay for their rescue. Dealers are usually the last link in the chain of the lives of many equines, after sports careers, riding school, educational farms, and so on. And we are now in Cyprus. Both private owners and authorities following Caesar relinquish equines to sanctuaries. In the picture, Mercedes, a donkey is over its 30s and a working life in a remote area of the island spent with the same family. It doesn't really matter what is the reason an equine is in need of a new home, but too many equines are not so lucky as Mercedes. With a lifespan of 25-30 years, the majority change owners and activities many times. Sanctuaries play a key role. Whatever sanctuary we are talking about, from a small center with scarce resources run by passionate volunteers to established charities with teams of specialized staff, they all mainly rely on the donation and support of citizens. Economic and institutional support by governments is still an illusion for too many. Sanctuaries are left alone to navigate through an ocean of different requirements, paperwork, permission, as in many countries they won't fit in any legal and fiscal category, and rules may change province by province. Sanctuaries provide care, housing, and rehabilitation, whose ultimate aim is the peaceful end to our journey. A loving home and family where to feel protected, well cared for, and experience freedom. A place where to live free from pain, fear, physical and mental suffering, free to express their uniqueness as individuals. This is the priceless gain for all staff members of an organization whose huge daily efforts ensure each individual equine receive appropriate care and treatment. But it's important to notice that equines are not so easy to be at home, as they need space, suitable facilities, money, time, and care. To date, at the donkey sanctuary alone, the number of donkeys coming in is still higher than the ones that get rehome, despite all the efforts by many teams to reduce the number of admissions through owners and community support programs. The COVID-19 crisis has already hit sanctuaries with an increased request of relinquishment, and more would come in the coming months and years, in a scenario of uncertain incomes for many charities. And so we'll end now here again in this virtual room. There are not official, I like to remind you that those were just case studies. Any of these issues can occur everywhere across Europe. Greece, France, Portugal, Hungary, Poland, and so on. There are not official figures about how many people in equine welfare organizations work in Europe. However, from my experience, I can say that we are already doing the best with passion and determination to help equines that suffer and are in need. But alone, we cannot succeed. With the economic impact of the COVID-19, there is little or no capacity at the charities of the equine welfare system to address this situation that moves from bad to worst. We need your help and government support to strengthen the system and collaborate with relevant stakeholders to improve the welfare of thousands of equines. So I hope that you have enjoyed this trip and really want to thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Barbara. We strongly and structurally appreciate your work and the work of several NGOs across Europe. I will pass the word to Reineke so she can check if there's any questions to you.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you, Barbara, for taking us on this rather depressing tour, but it really highlighted the key issues. I would like to ask Tilly Matt, would you like to come in and ask a question? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Hello, Reineke. Thank you for this very interesting and also not easy presentation of situation of many donkeys around Europe, but around the world, I guess. I was last year in Santorini, where the situation for donkeys is also not easy, let's say like that. How do you do to raise awareness, to sensibilize people that we have this representation of donkeys? A lot of people say, yeah, they are a little bit dumb, etc. Is there also some campaigning, raising awareness, especially of the situation of donkeys who, versus the horses, have not the elegance, of course, but are very smart and sensitive animals. So is there also, are you doing some campaigning to raise awareness about the situation of donkeys, which in many times often is quite ignored, and we have this stupid representation also about donkeys. So is there some work done there? Thank you, and thank you very much for your work and for raising awareness here in the Intergroup.
So thank you very much for your question. It's quite a complex question. So about Santorini, this is included in a wider program about the tourism industry that the Donkey Sanctuary is running. So in particular in Santorini, the program that we are running is based on collaboration with different stakeholders. So from the unions of taxi owners on the island to authorities, I mean the vet authorities, police, the police force, and also the municipality. We are all together trying to improve the situation of those animals. We have been also supported by CLIA, so the International Cruise Association, that has shared our main campaign that is called In der Hoofs, that can be found in our website, which is an awareness campaign that asks to the tourists, so the clients of working equids, to put themselves in their hoofs. So to think about which is the level of care that those working animals are receiving, which are the working conditions in that particular moment that they are working, if they look, for example, exhausted or well cared. So really, with few questions, try to think about how you can feel in their hooves. So yes, the tourist campaign, the tourism industry has many different aspects in Europe and not just in Europe. But mules and donkeys work in various places as taxis, as well as moving, of course, burdened by tourists. I mean, baggage, for example, on Hydra, a small island of Greece, because there are no vehicles at all on the island. Mules and donkeys move, every type of stuff throughout the island, in the island. I hope to have answered you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks again for your work, really. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I see that Joe Collins, also from the Donkey Sanctuary, would like to come in and maybe add a bit to what Barbara already said.
Yes, can you hear me okay, Reineke? Yes, if you can hear me. I'd just like to pick up the second part of what Mrs. Metz asked about, which is about the perception of donkeys and the adverse way that they're often spoken about. I'm a veterinarian, and it has taken me a long time during my career as an equine veterinarian to understand exactly what she's speaking about. And now in the Donkey Sanctuary, I have to say to you that we work long and hard to try and change this public perception about donkeys and mules. So the Donkey Sanctuary website based out of the UK has a very wide range of resources that are available for professionals like veterinarians and dental technicians and physiotherapists, etc., but also for those who own and keep donkeys and mules, directly aimed at what Mrs. Metz is talking about, which is about educating people about the true value and worth of donkeys. They are very resilient creatures. they are much more, in my personal opinion, much more insightful as a species actually than many horses. They people, in my view, often think about many of our horses as being very intelligent because they are more trainable. But donkeys actually are less easily made to do something that they don't wish to do or that they don't see is in their own interest. So in fact, as a trainer, and I'm not an expert in this area, we have many of them at the Donkey Sanctuary, it is much more important to ask a donkey and mule to suggest to them and to give them an opportunity themselves to process their response. So it's quite a different approach than the horse. And that's because in terms of evolution, they have a very different evolutionary pathway, and they have developed mechanisms that are suited to them as a species. And so I thank Mrs. Metz for that question. I want to make one further comment to link Mr. Whitaker's speech with Roly Owers, our next speaker. And we do face a perfect storm in the equine welfare world. And my colleague Barbara has mentioned indiscriminate breeding. Because of the long gestation period of horses and donkeys, we find that there is a lag period between production and the subsequent problem. So we are all very concerned that next year, as Mr. Whitaker mentioned, and the year after, we are facing ever increasing problems because we will have these animals produced, bred, produced, and delivered into the marketplace, so to speak. And then we, the animal welfare charities, the NGO sector, will have a major problem to deal with. And exactly as he has spoken about, we all face significant challenges with fundraising. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Joe. Telly, you want to say something more?
No, I just wanted to say that was very interesting. Thank you for this further explanations.
Yeah, and thank you for painting such an incredible picture of the donkey, Joe. I could see the next speaker looking a bit doubtful, but let's see about that. There's one more question from MEP Guteland. I would like to ask you, Jette, to keep your question till the end, if fine with you, because it's time to move to the next speaker, Francisco.
Yes, thank you, Heineke. So let's talk about what can the EU and member states do regarding this crisis. So I would like to present Roly Owens, Chief Executive Officer of the World Horse Welfare Organization, who will tell us on what the EU and member states can concretely do to help on this situation. So I give the floor to Roly Owens. We can see the...
Francisco, thank you very much. Sorry, technical problems of unmuting. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Obviously, I will bite my tongue and not bring you a defense of why horses might be better than donkeys. But from Dr. Collins's intervention, I do take great heart, because like many parents around Europe who've had to homeschool, I take great heart the fact that my child might be more insightful, because I find it less easy to train. And I'm sure that will be great solace for parents across the continent. But anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity, and what I've got the great honour of bringing together what Matt and Barbara have talked about the challenges of the sector and some very graphic case studies, and what we might be able to do collectively, and specifically what the EU and member states can do. Just having a slight problem on trying to get this. What is not new, as we stand back before getting into the detail of the presentation, what is not new is that we increasingly recognise that the health and welfare of animals, humans and the environment are increasingly and inextricably linked. And this was very graphically presented in last week, where a report launched at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum by the United Nations Environment Programme and the International Livestock Research Institute graphically showed how we need to act going forward to prevent future pandemics, but also going forward to be able to create sustainable change. And so the concepts of one health and one welfare very much need to underpin what we do in the future increasingly. And so the EU and indeed global governments need to embrace these principles if we really are to create that sustainable change. But I think it's important, just before we get into the detail again, to step back and see what is currently going on. And there is a lot to be very encouraged about. Sustainability and One Health concept rightly underpin the farm to fork strategy and the Green Deal, and these to be widely commended. For the farm to fork strategy, equidae are not one of the traditional farmed animal species, but equally should not be forgotten as they are developed. And for the Green Deal, it's important to recognise the role of equines to fulfil environment and rural communities across the continent. For the fitness check, we are delighted that the transport regulation is going to be reviewed, because we believe it's unenforceable and unenforced in its current form and really does need to change. The EU platform on animal welfare is an excellent forum to bring stakeholders together from across the continent, member states, commercial business, NGOs, academia. It is an excellent establishment, but what really needs to be focused on is ensuring the outputs of the platform are really implemented across the continent. We welcome the recent announcement from the EU to establish the EU Reference Centre for Ruminants and Equidae, because this is clearly shows the importance of equines to the continent, to the EU. And of course, the animal health law has been running for a number of years now. It's a very positive initiative, and not least because it focuses greater focus on registration and traceability of equines, which is fundamental to protecting their health and welfare. But we equally need to consider the impacts of loading and unloading of equines on journeys and the practicalities of residency periods. So, and what are the member states doing? Again, we are not at all coming from a standing start, because a number of member states across the EU have animal welfare laws, and some, not many, but some have species-specific welfare laws, such as the widely lauded horse law in Denmark. But of course, we know that legislation is not much if it's not enforced, and that's why it is so important that there's an equal focus on enforcement. And EU countries across the continent do focus on enforcement, especially around farm animals. But as we've already said, equines do tend to fall between the cracks of whether they are a farm animal or a companion animal, or indeed whether they're just equines. And we've heard much from Matt about the funding for for charities, and there are examples across the continent, such as in Ireland, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, charities can apply for grants. In Germany, the state of Bavaria helps fund shelters, as do other regions and cities like Cologne. And in Austria, funds are provided to promote animal welfare as well. And there will be others. But as Matt has already sort of very eloquently told us, you know, if a sector is undervalued, that support is unlikely to be able to meet the need, and that is in normal times. But what about support for response during the current pandemic? What the first thing, I think, as we come to from a European perspective, we are very much coming to whatever phase one is before we move into phase two and potentially a second wave. What we've really got to do is make sure we learn the lessons of what's happened over the last few weeks and months. It is so important that we provide key worker status to people working in shelters so that they could help prevent welfare emergencies. Animals need looking after, so it's so important that wherever animals are kept, the owners or alternative persons are able to go and care for these animals, because whatever the level of restriction, so long as social distancing and other health protocols are followed. As Barbara has already told us, equines live for many, many years, and the engine room of being able to cope with more cases coming in is to be able to rehome. And charities across the EU and Europe have shown that they can continue to rehome whilst complying with social distancing and other health protocols. The role of vets is so important. Of course, they've always been allowed to attend emergencies, but there are those hidden preventative issues, such as neutering, to be able to prevent future population explosion, that are so important to be able to carry on during the outbreaks as well as during peacetime. There's been a real challenge about providing constant, consistent and realistic guidance to equine owners and equine establishments. And just one example of here in the UK is the challenges of dealing with indoor arenas, where they were viewed very much the same as indoor gyms, which of course we know is far from the truth. And then, of course, we can do all we like, but there is, as we've heard, this perfect storm, and therefore funding from government, from the EU, to support equine rescue centres is going to be vital. So why is all this important? I think, we've already heard that equines are woven into the fabric of our society in so many different ways, and they support people's well-being, and especially in rural communities, they support their livelihoods as well. Equines are large animals, they cost a considerable amount to keep, and they are highly visible to people. And so when things go wrong, that's very well known in the public domain, but equally governments will get called on to act. But we know equines are so versatile, as from being a food source in one sense, to being an elite sport horse animal in another, to being an animal for therapy and supporting people's well-being in another. So they don't easily fit into any one category, and too often they do fall between the legislative cracks. And bottom line, when things go wrong, it does cost money. Just in last year, the city of Dublin in Ireland spent nearly €150,000 removing horses abandoned by their owners. So it really, on so many different levels, does really bear fruit to act. So what are animal welfare charities doing? What is the sector doing? It's very much learning from the lessons of the 2008 crisis. For example, in the UK, there's some equine crisis funding has been provided by the sector for the small equine rescue centres, because they provide a very important service. But it's about dealing with the fact, as we've heard about from Matt. And so the collating of evidence, the conducting of surveys to see what the impact is on the ground for equine welfare and equine welfare organisations is so important. And then to be able to, as we have been doing, pass that information through to government. And to be able to, NGOs have been working very hard to work with government guidance that's been provided during the sharp part of the outbreak, to ensure that there's consistent guidance given to owners, so that they know how to look after their animals whilst also protecting public health. It has meant a lot of innovation, and that's been working in partnership, certainly from an example of doing virtual home checks and virtual rehoming, so rehoming can carry on whilst minimizing human contact. But we know that coming down the road this winter, it is widely predicted there is going to be a huge surge in equine welfare cases and equine welfare challenges. So other forms of funding, such as seeking government support for a subsidised euthanasia scheme, are one of the many schemes that will need to be looked at to see how we can cope with this crisis. So very much coming to the nub and the final slide of my presentation, what can we do? I think Matt has already sort of given us that phrase, build back better. It is so important that we don't just do what we did before and carry on making the same mistakes. So the EU, the European Commission, has a real leadership role to encourage member states to provide that logistical and financial support for the sector, because investment assessment today, prevention will always be better than cure. We've already outlined for member states to provide this short-term support to equine welfare initiatives and equine welfare organisations. But it is not a one-trick pony. We do need to continue to focus on the initiatives that are ongoing. Equine ID is so important as a fundamental building block of protecting equine health and welfare. We've already mentioned the importance of the animal health law. Communication, as I've already said, is fundamental, that we have a consistent and constant message coming from government to the sector to owners so people know how to act. There has been a call, and we fully support, for the establishment of an equine welfare working group to help develop these contingency plans, to engage with EU member states, the European Commission, the sector and animal welfare NGOs. But it's so important that that is done, in our view, under the EU Animal Welfare Platform. There is the ability to establish formal structures under the platform to build on the outstanding success of the informal structures. And it's wonderful to see Berta Broberg, who chaired the informal voluntary equine working group, which has produced some outstanding guidance for on the caring of horses and donkeys. And it's really important that we build on that success, as I mentioned earlier, going forward. And of course, there are wider initiatives going on within the EU around the new Marshall Plan for European tourism, around the strategy for Roma inclusion. All of these need to have an equine welfare perspective built into them. It's so important if we're to have an interconnected, and we know about the interconnectivity between animal health, animal welfare, and the wider sector. It's so important we have that joined up approach to government. So if I could finish, if Matt talks about Build Back Better, which is such a brilliant sort of summary, for us it's around the 3 C's. It's around coordinating what we know and what we've learned from the first round of this pandemic. It is about communicating clearly between government, with the sector, and out to owners. And of course it is about supporting costs, because there is a perfect storm on NGOs across Europe, and we quite simply will not survive without support from across the EU and member states. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Owens. We are right on schedule, but I will pass the word to Reineke so she can check if there's like one question or really important, so we can then move on to the 20 minutes debate. Reineke, I think you, yeah.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Rob. Can you hear me now, Francesco?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. I would like to invite Jytte Guteland to ask her a question, please.
Thank you, Reineke. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Thank you also for thank you. Thank you also for all the excellent presentations. It's of most importance to all of us, I believe, and it was also many new facts that came to my knowledge. Me, myself, I always loved horses. It's my passion in my life, and still it's the passion, but it was really interesting to learn more about the donkeys as well, and mules, and to really know their special qualities. I actually, my question was before the last panelist, so I got many of the answers there, but I wondered how one could use the CAP reform also. But then I learned that the farm to fork reform could be of interest, and how we can integrate that in solutions. So I will take that to my knowledge. I'm very grateful for that solution. But if you have something in the CAP reform that you like to mention, I'm happy to hear, because we work on that now. And then I also want to say that when I got all the information about how we need to work with the welfare for the horses and donkeys, and also in the member states, and the legislation for that, and also on tourism, I'm thinking about something that always bothered me a lot when I went to different cities or even in the countryside in different member states in Europe, when I see horses standing waiting for tourists, and they are really warm and it's really hot, and I'm just thinking, is that covered in your solutions here? Can we do more? Because I'm not sure that this is I think it's a big problem. That's what I want to say. I really see that these animals many times are suffering from waiting a long time. It can't be normal to stand like that the way we see in Europe. I know I'm not the first one to raise this. I know this is probably covered in the welfare solution that you have and that you brought to me. But the situations like that, can we put an end to it? Is it more to do? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jytte. Rolly, are you happy to take this question also about what the new CAP could possibly bring in terms of better equine welfare? And to respond to Jytte's question about the use, the various use of animals also in tourism, and how the EU could tackle those issues.
Thank you. Very happy to respond. I'm probably not the best to respond around the CAP reform, but what is, and Reineke, I'm sure you can add to this, but what is clear is we need to get a greater recognition for the roles of horses in the environment. They have a significant role. Someone, I think I saw a question on the Danube Delta in Romania, but across Europe, horses do have a fundamental role in supporting a sustainable and green future. And that certainly needs to be recognised within future reform, as does that economic support for especially rural communities of the equine sector. Turning to the piece around tourism, that is a long road that has been focused on. I think there are two elements to this. There are guidelines around responsible tourism, and a number of different NGOs have been involved in developing those. So it is a question of regulation, but it's also a question of awareness. So tourists are aware of what constitutes good welfare, and therefore they will more likely take a ride with a horse and cart, for example, that is showing good welfare. And there are very practical solutions to providing certainly shade, to providing water during the day for these animals, because they are strong animals and they can provide that surface, but their basic needs certainly need to be fulfilled. So it's a question of awareness for tourists, but also providing that regulation.
Thank you for that explanation,
Thank
Rolly.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. And to add to what you mentioned about the CAP reform, yes, Jytte, I think that it would be very good if the Commission was to include equine welfare in the guidance to the member states on the strategic plans, because at the moment they don't have a strong position. And it would, of course, be excellent if responsible equine-related projects could be supported by CAP funding and could be embedded in the strategic plans that will be put forward by the member states. And this can also link to tourism. And here the guidance Rolly mentioned, developed by the animal welfare platform, could really come into handy also to be used by the competent authorities to test whether initiatives are indeed also adhering to equine welfare principles or not. So I think there are a lot of perspectives, but now we also need to make sure that they are being used, and that is not a given, because I think that equine welfare, it is getting more attention, but it's still hugely underestimated at EU level. So thank you for that question. And then, yes, Rolly, you mentioned already something on the question in the Q&A about the Danube Delta in Romania. Could you say something more about this? Are you aware of any conservation programs for these horses?
I'm aware certainly Four Paws, which is Valuation, has a project on the Danube. It is what happens on the Danube is reflected in other countries too, and the issues that we don't really any longer have any truly wild horses. So these semi-feral equine populations still need management, and if they're not managed, then there are going to be significant equine welfare issues. So it's in the UK, we have a number of commons and moors where there's a very similar, maybe to a less large scale. So the key here is that intervention and early intervention is so important. Otherwise, it really does store up problems further down the road. But for the Danube, I'm aware of, as I say, Valuation at the moment, and I'm sure through Eurogroup we could identify if any other NGOs are involved in that particular issue.
Thank you, Rolly. Thanks for that further explanation. We have another question from Mrs. Virkunen. You can unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And maybe it's not so much a question, it's also more comment. I'm Henna Virkunen, member of European Parliament from Finland, and I'm also horse owner myself, and also the chairman of Horse Owners Association in Finland. I'm sorry, I was a little bit late on this meeting, so I heard just Rolly's presentation, and it was really good, because now we really heard what is going on in the European level, and what's going on in the member states level, and what can be done for the equine welfare together. And I think, like Jutta Goodland already said, that it was a very good idea that we should also include more the ideas to this farm to fork strategy, because the horses, they don't have very big role on that. So I think this is something we could now work in the parliament together, because we have also this horse group in the parliament, and I think it's important that the members from different political groups are working together to promote the horse and equine welfare. So I'd like to just thank all the speakers and you for organizing this meeting, and I think these were very good ideas you had already, so we are very willing to work together with you to promote these important initiatives.
Thank you so much for that intervention. And indeed, the farm to fork strategy could potentially also contribute to better equine welfare. However, at the moment, there's no explicit mention on equine welfare. So perhaps it would also be an idea to include this in the forthcoming own initiative report by the European Parliament, to really make sure also that the several actions as outlined in Rolly's presentations will be considered as part of the implementation of the farm to fork strategy, because there's a perfect match with the objectives of the farm to fork strategy. So thank you for that. Rolly, anything else from your side? Would you like to supplement something to what you already said following Mrs. Virkunen comment?
Only to say thank you, and the MEP Horse Group is such an important initiative, and working closely with the European Horse Network to create that cross-sector alliance to speak to the European Parliament and also to the European Commission. So we are trying to be as joined up as we can be, because the challenges we face clearly are across the sector, and the challenges with the horses and equines, they can fulfil so many different roles in their own lifetime that it means that we need to have that collaborative approach if we are going to create those sustainable solutions. So thank you.
Very good, and indeed, it's important to connect the dots between the Intergroup and the MEP horse platform. I see that Joe Collins would like to come in and provide some further thoughts. Joe?
Yes, thank you very much, Reinicke. I just wanted to raise the issue of funding for animal welfare NGOs. So Rolly mentioned that some member states, including he mentioned Ireland, currently directly fund some animal welfare organisations. So in Ireland, the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine last year provided €3 million of public monies to animal welfare NGOs spread across a whole variety of them. We're not just talking equine here. And there's of course a very strong protocol of application for those ex gratia funding and inspection of the animal welfare NGOs and the work they do, the rescue, rehoming, and so on. And interestingly, in Ireland, only 2 weeks ago, a new national government was formed, and the Greens party have joined as the smaller partner of 3 in a coalition. And as part of that program for government, they have included an aspiration that the ex gratia funding to animal welfare organizations would be doubled over the period of the next few years. And I just wonder whether from Europe centrally there is any potential, you spoke about cap funding, for the funding that is provided by national, well, 2 things. One is that member states might be encouraged to provide funding to the animal welfare NGO sector, and many member states don't do this. And secondly, that if national governments do provide funding to animal welfare NGOs, that, for example, centrally that money could be co-funded, could be doubled. Is there any potential for MEPs to the Commission and to encourage them, in particularly the post-COVID pandemic era, that more funding would be provided directly to NGOs in member states?
Thank you, Joe, for this question. Would one of the MEPs want to react to that? Any views on whether the Commission, or whether you think it is possible for the Commission to steer member states in the direction of allocating more funding, more financial support towards the equine sector, the charity sector? I see some MEPs thinking, so we wait a bit.
Yes. But of course, we need to try. We need to focus on this. We need to put pressure on the Commission to do it. And for me, this is a bit of a wake-up call that is one of the tools we need to use. So if we can have something after this meeting, an initiative to put some pressure, I would like to join others and do that.
Very good idea. There are several options now on the table. There's the COVID-19 recovery funds, which will also be used for the support of the agricultural sector, for example. And then there's the new cap. So it would be good to invite the Commission to explore several options to provide possible support, or to really guide the member states to support the equine charity sector. So thank you for bringing that up, Joe. Andreas, you would also like to come in. I see you raised your hand. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah. So I have a question from Vesna Caminades, the director of the Regio Tirol office here in Brussels. She wanted to know whether it would be helpful to invest more in education programs of children and adolescents to contribute solving the problems.
Thank you, Andreas. Roly, would you like to react to that question?
Absolutely, and the answer is a big yes. And you do struggle with education curriculum across countries because it is so full, and therefore trying to add anything else in is always met with a degree of resistance. But a more enlightened approach, and it has worked in some countries, especially outside Europe, where actually animal welfare can be incorporated to educate around a whole variety of areas, including from maths in terms of how much to feed an animal and across that piece. So absolutely, that early intervention and a greater understanding of animal sentience and animal welfare can only be a huge positive for the future. So we certainly do encourage that where it is implemented, and we know interactions connections between children and animals at an early age has a hugely beneficial approach. So it doesn't have to be a complicated intervention at all. As simple as so often the better way forward. But yes, those early interventions at primary and secondary education level has a huge amount. And indeed, you know, when we look at a wider context of what we're doing across the globe and working in low and middle income countries, there are organizations like Spana based here in the UK who have an excellent education program. I know the Donkey Sanctuary, World Horse Welfare and others are looking to support and partner that. So yes, early intervention, it has huge benefits.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rolly. Maybe as a last intervention, could I invite Beerte Broberg to come in, because we have the pleasure to have you at our meeting this morning, Beerte. We know you are a very strong equine advocate working for the Danish government, but also leading the subgroup under the Animal Welfare Platform on equine welfare. What are your sort of key takeaways from today's meeting? What would be your message to all the listeners today, and to, of course, the institutions? Beerte, can you unmute yourself? I can see you speaking, but you're still on mute.
Okay, now?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Yeah, I've been looking for some button to pose a question or to give a comment, but I didn't find one. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's opened my eyes that there are a lot of problems, maybe not only caused by the COVID-19 crisis, but problems that have existed before this and that will also probably, unfortunately, exist after the crisis. So I think there is a need for the Commission to take some initiative, and the suggestion by Rolly to establish a subgroup, a Commission subgroup under the platform would be a brilliant idea. And I think it should not only deal with contingency plans on what to do when the next crisis come, it could also deal with some of the existing problems. The tourism problem have been raised today, and I think that's an important one that needs more attention. We discussed it only briefly in the voluntary initiative group. It certainly needs more attention, and I think a platform, a subgroup, could be a good way of dealing with that problem, as well as other problems. I may not see all the problems that exist in the EU countries. I know, of course, of some of them, but coming from a country where we didn't really see these kind of problems during this crisis, of course, we now and then have a situation where owners do not take the responsibility the way they should, but hopefully it will be handled. But a subgroup under the platform to deal with a number of different issues relating to horse welfare, I see that as a brilliant idea. And I hope that there will be some pressure on the Commission to really establish this. So thank you very much, and thank you also for very good presentations.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Beerte Broberg. So yes, Francisco, I think there's a lot of food for thought, a lot of input to take forward. So maybe you could wrap up what was shared today, and also share what the Intergroup is going to do next on equine welfare. So how will all the input be taken forward? Francisco, over to you again.
Thanks. Before we head up to conclusions, I would like to give the floor to Klaus Buchner, because he's now here. And if he wants to take a few words, in the beginning, dear Klaus, we presented this certificate to you of the Animal Welfare Intergroup due to your work. And if you would like to take the floor a few minutes to say some words, we will really appreciate due to your work during these years on improving animal welfare in the EU. So take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm not Miss Ripa, as you can see. My link didn't work, so I used hers. And Manuela Ripa will be succeeding me. Just to give a few ideas what I did in the last time, I was campaigning a lot against industrial farming and all the problems for the animals there. And Manuela, my successor, will continue this campaign. Actually, she has some very good ideas. A second thing I was doing is creed for stray animals, for dogs and cats. Actually, we went up quite high in the administration, even to the minister's level. But finally, the whole thing was cut and we had no success at all. We have to admit this, sorry, but now people are no longer interested and cut all the relation. Well, we will continue, of course. It's a situation for the moment, but maybe in some months, some years, it will change. In any case, we will not forget this problem. So I thank you all a lot. I learned a lot in this intergroup, and thank you, goodbye. Tomorrow is my last day in the parliament, and then I shall care about different things. Bye-bye, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's not a goodbye, it's a see you soon. So we'll hope to continue working with you and have the best luck on your retirement. We are sure you continue very active as you always have been. Concluding on the debates we had, I would like to refer to the key aspects that have been raised and which encompass the following. First of all, targeted NGOs support is needed. The emergency financial measures put in place by the EU and member states governments should be inclusive of equine welfare rescue organizations, as they alleviate pressure from taxpayers and serve the public interest. I think it's common for us to conclude that we call upon the Commission to encourage the member states to provide the logistic and financial supports to equine welfare rescue organizations in these challenging times. Secondly, we urge to develop human equine contingency plans. Given the rather high cost of good equine care, there is vested concern that many people will not be able to keep or take care of their equines anymore. NGOs will then bear the burden and will struggle to pick up the pieces. Hence, the European Commissions, the member states and animal welfare organizations should jointly come up with a viable contingency plan that would safeguard equine welfare in the new economic reality, for instance, by establishing an equine welfare working group, as it was mentioned here before. Programs such as the new Marshall Plan for European tourism, or the strategy for Roma inclusion post-2020 should also address the equine welfare where applicable. And last but not least, ensure access to provision of care for equines. In the case of a second wave of COVID-19, the Commission should encourage the member states to apply proportionate measures. This should foresee that owners, keepers, veterinaries, and other service providers can continue to have access to equines so as to safeguard their welfare. Such provisions should be applied both domestically and across borders, bearing in mind the necessary sanitary and precautionary principles. Staff of rescue facilities and volunteers must be included in the list of essential workers so that they can keep on taking care of these animals. The transport of equines to and from veterinary and rescue centers should also be allowed to continue. These are the main conclusions. Thank you for all for being here. Just a final remark to announce the next intergroup meeting. The session is likely to be held during the week of between 21 and 25th of September. We will inform you about the details of the meeting, of course. And until then, I wish you all, on behalf of the whole Animal Welfare Intergroup, a nice summer break, and do relax because we have much work to do, and keep up the good work. Count on us to continue collaborating on the several issues regarding animal welfare. Thanks to all for being here, and have a nice break. Thanks to the services also. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.